So, hello there and welcome to Cinema Eclectica, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are the Geek Show's dedicated movie podcast. I am Graham, and this week I have been overstressing certain unimportant words or sentences, but more importantly, I've been joined by Tim.
Hello.
Hello there. And we had a director's lottery at the end of last week's show, which came out with Catherine Bigelow. And after a bit of discussion, the film we chose was Near Dark, which I'm excited to say spoonerises to Dear Narc.
What does that mean?
It's just, if you're writing a letter to a narc.
Yeah, I suppose so.
It's polite.
It could refer to a narco drug enforcement agent of some kind.
It could, yeah, or just a low-down dirty snitch.
Yeah, either of which, to be honest, would reasonably well fit into Catherine Bigelow's filmography the other way of something to do with anti-Colombian guerrilla warfare or something.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But in the end...
No, it isn't, Graham, it's drivel. Sorry, carry on.
Yes, but in the end, we selected Near Dark, which... had you seen this film before, Tim?
I hadn't. It was actually a bit of a gap in my knowledge of kind of like supernatural horror movies, I guess. As regarded as kind of a bit of a cult film. I don't know if it's one of those very, very large, ubiquitous cults. It's probably one of those small cults that only a few people like.
Yeah. It's not like your proper Jonestown cult. It's more of a good, solid kind of breatharian thing.
Yes.
This is her vampire western starring Adrian Pasdar and, let's face it, almost all of the cast of Aliens.
Yes, for some reason. Yeah.
Yes.
Lance Hendrickson, who plays Bishop in Aliens.
Yeah.
Hang on, is it Bill Pullman who plays...
Oh, you're on the wrong side of the Pullman-Paxton gap.
It is Bill Paxton, who plays Gorman in Aliens. No, who plays Hudson in Aliens.
That's it, yes, Hudson, yeah.
I got confused the same way that... Sorry?
Sorry. Go on.
Let's stop talking about Aliens and start talking about Near Dark.
Yeah, I think so. Because it's a pretty straightforward plot, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not that long a movie either, to tell you the truth. I mean, you referred to it as a vampire western, which it kind of seems to have a reputation as, although I don't know whether you'd say that, whether I'd have said the western aspect is kind of that strong in it in a way. It's got kind of some images that are very resonant, but on the other hand, it's quite a kind of modern movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a road movie as well, in a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I say it's not a western. It's got a scene where a man in a cowboy hat riding on horseback lassos somebody.
Yeah, and there's a bar fight.
Yes, true, there is.
Western bar fight, yeah, which is amazing.
What were you going to say about it next?
Well, I mean, as you know, I believe everything up to and including Seven Brides for Seven Brothers is clearly a western. But yeah. I think this has pretty strong western DNA.
Okay, sure.
I mean, it's a small-town story about a community that's threatened by a wandering group of drifters, some of whom are, in a running gag that I really appreciated, implied to have been involved in pretty much every major event of 19th century American history.
Yeah. Including they being immortal vampires, having fought in the Civil War, contributed to the Great Chicago Fire.
Yes.
But
yeah, I'm sure there's others. I'm pretty sure that had Bigelow, been able to complete a director's cut, we'd have learned about one of them assassinating Abraham Lincoln or something, if it was like it's going in that direction.
And it's set against a kind of backdrop of modern, it's Texas, isn't it?
I'm not sure if it's specified, but
I've forgotten which state it is. They talk at one point about where the state line is and how long it'll take to get there and things like that. And in a sense, it really makes very little difference, I guess. It essentially follows a kind of family of cattle ranchers who get entangled with these, sort of drifting vampires.
Yeah.
Who are a kind of gang of kind of eccentric sort of maniacs, really. But the main character, the son of the family. Oh, what was the main character's name, Graham?
Caleb.
Caleb, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
The main character, Caleb, gets, essentially kind of picks up the young woman of the vampire clan probably for a one-night stand, only to get bitten and infected with vampirism. Subsequently joins up with them and then gets tracked down again by his dad and his little sister, who sort of come after him, trying to locate him after the police make a obviously pretty poor effort to take on the vampires. And it's, like you said, it's in a sense a relatively straightforward plot that doesn't kind of escalate much past that. It's essentially just that the horror of the vampires' actions kind of increases as the movie goes on, and it becomes more obvious how mad and violent and sadistic they are, I suppose, when it kind of seems like at the moment they're slightly kind of romantic kind of, drifters where you could just up sticks and join them and you would be an immortal and go wherever you want. And then gradually their treatment of the main character and his family gets worse and worse across the course of the movie.
I mean, romantic is one of those words that is always fascinating to use as a lens to look at vampire stories. This was released at roughly the same time as Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys was released.
Oh, right.
Which is kind of like, it's kind of like the Brat Pack vampire film with sexy young stars, and it was a huge box office hit at the time, and Near Dark was not. I think Near Dark does a pretty good job of kind of squaring the circle of having a family of vampires who, on the one hand, are, pretty charismatic and fun to watch, particularly Bill Paxton's character. He's great in this. But on the other hand, are really horrible and vicious. Yeah.
I mean, it's got a few kind of, tropes that I guess turn up in sort of semi-regularly in vampire films. It has the proper child vampire, someone who was bitten and is now stuck as an eternal child.
Child vampire.
Yeah, so she's really quite
vampire tropes.
She's really quite sinister. She kills her victims by posing as like a stricken child who's had an accident or something, like she's fell off a bike.
Yeah.
So she just sits there on a bike by the side of the road, and then a passerby comes out and said, "Oh, you all right, kid?" At which point she just rips their throat out, pretty much. The other thing I say, it makes for kind of, like I say, there's a sort of road movie. It drifts along kind of American highway locations and I guess sort of, Western kind of backdrop locations in some ways. But I had to think, well, it makes some good use of that, like the kind of, obviously the kind of stock backdrops like the, sort of trucker's bar with the neon signs on the walls and that kind of thing, the roadside tavern and the trailer park. And a few, I like the feels of the oil jacks that hinge up and down, those big hammer things, whatever those are called. Yeah. Which I thought was a terrific kind of setting for a sort of nighttime scene where those things are swaying up and down constantly in the background while the two main characters are deciding whether or not to kill somebody or which of them will kill somebody. But on the other hand, I thought that it could have done, if anything, with a bit more kind of slightly surreal stuff like that. I don't know.
I guess, although I did appreciate how you get more of that as it goes on. Like the final confrontation is extraordinary, because normally when I go back to 80s action films, because I didn't grow up watching them, I find them a bit of a letdown. I've heard so much about how they're absolutely awesome. And I just think, well, I'd rather watch a director who loved this stuff homage it well, if you get my meaning, and get to the appeal that they find of it, rather than pretend that I see it myself. But the last act of this genuinely does have that kind of weird, minimalist kind of Nicholas Winding Refn-y feel, which again is, I suppose, is filtered through Western tropes. The standoff between the hero and the truck is shot like an old-fashioned high noon gunfight. They stand their ground until the confrontation begins. And it does have that kind of chilly, minimalist quality that I think is really cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree there. On the other hand, it made it slightly less of an impression on me overall. I mean, things like the standoff with the truck, I sort of felt like they'd overinvested a bit of the budget on, big cans of petrol, to be honest, for the last act of the movie, which is that they managed to blow up, they blow up the truck in a spectacular fireball, and they blow up another car in a huge fireball. They
Yes.
And then obviously this is, I was thinking about this during this, wondering whether this is the source for the idea that vampires don't really kind of catch fire and burn in daylight, but actually explode.
Oh, it could be actually, yeah, because I can't think of a preceding film which has that.
Yeah, which is a pretty serious escalation from the sort of role of Dracula where he basically just doesn't like to go outside in daylight, you know.
He can't use his powers in daylight, isn't it, in Bram Stoker's novel? And then F.W. Murnau created the idea of vampires dying in sunlight, and look where we are now.
Well, they actually blow up. I only hope that future cinema in the century ahead just increases the force of the explosion in some way to the, I don't know. But, vampires are getting more and more dangerous in that respect. But
I think vampires are getting weaker, to be honest. You know, when you think about vampires in the Victorian age could go out during sunlight, and vampires nowadays are all, I'll explode.
Yeah,
not being aggressive.
Yeah. Just whinging, really.
Yeah.
I vaguely recall Brad Pitt's character in Interview with the Vampire, who, on the other hand, was rather, if anything, rather incautious about this, which is at one, he obviously avoids the sun, and then he gets glad when cinema is finally invented so that he can go and watch the sun rising in a movie. And if it was me... Do you remember that bit?
I'd probably have bad associations with that, wouldn't you?
But also, you're taking a hell of a risk given you're suffering from like an ancient supernatural curse, aren't you? I mean, maybe a film of the sun will cause you to blow up just the same way.
Yeah.
And you would only find this out when... when
you watched it, yeah.
In this, they pretty much, in Near Dark, they more or less kind of start to burn, like really severe sunburn, and then it gets worse and worse, and after enough of it, they just blow up.
Yes.
But they do therefore kind of wallpaper out all the windows of their cars and that kind of thing, and wrap themselves in tinfoil and wear goggles in order to avoid it. But
which gives you the ingredients for this fantastic shootout, doesn't it? Where people shoot at their hideout, and not only do they have to dodge the bullets, they have to dodge the big shafts of sunlight that the bullet holes create.
Also, that they're in a really they're in a cheap shack with thin walls as part of this kind of trailer park, which means there's basically cops firing at them with assault rifle small sides, and the bullets kind of going all the way through and out the other side. You know, passing through one wall, through one of the vampires, and then out the other side again. So it pretty much turned the whole place into like Swiss cheese, really. But
yes,
I mean, I've got to admit to thinking that I didn't find the main character particularly interesting, though, and his kind of struggle of having become a vampire more or less worked as just a something to let us see inside the world of these vampires that are driving around in stolen trailers preying on people in the US South. But he himself, not so exciting, really, and even kind of gave the impression of being slightly, him and the story of his family being slightly sort of clumsily edited in. I don't know if you got that notion at the kind of start and end of the movie, which is all the best material. Well,
it was partly just...
Yeah, it's partly just the fact that they kind of seem like, the story at the start was him, taking up with the vampires, being bitten and turned into one, and sort of joining them and seeing their sort of worlds and lifestyle. So kind of this sort of weird kind of nighttime goings on that he was unaware were even happening, and are so kind of strange and exciting and frightening.
On the other hand, shadows, if you will.
Yeah. On the other hand, I feel like they could have departed easily enough from that and just kind of followed his story and left his domestic life behind him. And instead what happens has its charms. It goes the opposite way, which is that his dad and his sister actually pursue him and manage to catch up with the vampires and him. And so it doesn't completely kind of leave that behind at the start, which they could probably have got away with. On the other hand, they seem peculiarly blasé at the end when he goes back to the farm, having found a way to at least temporarily, cure him of vampirism. He goes back to the farm, and then they sit down and have dinner again and say, "Phew, that was good. At least that ordeal of the going on the road with a bunch of vampires for a while is over with." And it's like, aren't the vampires going to come and follow you and kill you now or kidnap you and get you back? As indeed they then do. And it's sort of like, well, I didn't think you were really out of the woods, to be honest, with having made the vampires obsessed with you and despising you. But still, I rather like that kind of bit of symbolism that his dad is a vet who looks after cattle, basically, right? Yeah. And so he gives him a blood transfusion, more or less, to get the vampirism out of his system and sort of bring him back into the real world, and I guess the daytime world that they sort of live in, which I thought worked pretty well.
Yeah, not the last blood transfusion we'll have on this episode of Eclectica either. Stay tuned,
right, okay.
listeners.
Yeah, it's the blood transfusion themed episode. The only thing is, despite all of that, and thinking it had a lot of quite good fun scenes, I didn't think it added up to a terribly effective movie overall. Partly just the length of it, partly thinking that it was slightly strangely cut and edited together in a way that made me think, maybe there was some muck-ups during production. So that the plot is very slightly clunky at the start and end.
I don't know. I really thought it was great fun.
Okay, yeah.
I suppose part of that is I don't want this to sound patronising, but I actually like Bigelow when she's working in a less ambitious register sometimes.
Okay.
Like nowadays, she wants to say a lot. And it's just enjoyable watching her do something that's just about, no, let's watch some vampires blow up. Vampires blowing up's fun.
Yeah. It has I think it's aged pretty well. It has quite a kind of 80s soundtrack, doesn't it? Sort of synthy, yeah.
Tangerine Dream, man, yeah. I mean,
okay,
it's very 80s, but it's fantastic, I think.
Yeah, it does still work pretty well. It hasn't... But the only other aspect of it is, I mean, obviously you're right, I'm completely mad to say that it's not so strongly associated with Westerns, because you're quite right, it's basically got the high noon standoff at the end in the form of a vampire against a 18-wheel truck, but still.
Yeah.
I kind of thought that they maybe just kind of overdid it a bit to try and create proper action movie thrills towards the end. Although I rather like this kind of image that the vampires seem to spread fire wherever they go. So in addition to, wherever they go, they leave fire behind them. They torch the vehicles that they drive in or the bars that they, kill people in, I suppose. Not really for any particular reason, I suppose, in a lot of cases. And then obviously that kind of catches up with them in the end and some of them get blown up.
It's like, it's the 80s action movie version of Nosferatu bringing a plague of rats, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. People throwing Molotov cocktails and stuff.
Yes.
I could have done, to be honest with it, if anything, a bit more of the kind of strange backstory of the vampires. Like you say, apart from the offhand references to having caused every event in the continental US in the 19th century. But you would have thought that the usual stuff you would expect would be a chance to look at an ancient photograph that shows one of them recognisable standing next to Ulysses S. Grant or something like that.
Yes.
But you don't really get a lot of that stuff, and you don't really get much of a kind of sense of a greater world of these vampires or creatures outside of just, roadside locations along this couple of American highways where this lot seem to have their hunting grounds. I'll tell you what else, though. The other thing about it is that as far as I noticed, the word vampire was never used.
Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah. So obviously you pick up pretty quickly off the fact that they drink blood, and it's the reasonably well-established vampire trope that not only do they have to... I should stop saying trope about everything, shouldn't I? The vampire, the form of vampirism where they drink some of your blood, you have to drink some of theirs, and that makes you into a vampire. Yeah, which is pretty much, that is the traditional form from Dracula, I think.
Yeah.
Aside from that, become immortal, but it can be cured with the blood transfusion. You violently catch fire and explode in sunlight. Is there anything else that's much of a departure? I mean, that's reasonably traditional vampirism by 1980, isn't it?
Yeah, the only thing that I think is generically unusual is, I suppose, what comes from cross-fertilising it with the Western, which is that these vampires have no real sense of place.
I see what you mean, yeah.
They are by necessity wanderers. They don't have to do that astonishing rigmarole that Dracula has to do with sending out coffins full of Transylvanian earth where he wants to establish himself. They don't even seem to have a sort of sentimental attachment to the old country unless you count, Jesse's nostalgia for fighting in the Civil War. They're just drifters.
And like I said, pretty much everywhere they go, they burn it after them. Completely scorched earth sort of policy, yeah.
Which, now I think about it, could be another Civil War reference, couldn't it?
Oh, I suppose so, yeah.
Yeah.
There's not any religious component either, is there, I don't think? There's no... Is there no Christianity fighting against them? There's no crucifixes, there's no stakes through the heart?
No, nothing like that, no.
Pretty much the cops and the main characters have a go at them with guns and rifles to not very much effect. It's the son that ultimately ends up killing them in this movie. Yeah.
Which I think is fair enough, as that stuff had been probably parodied to death by that point. I mean, I'm a big fan of the moment. It's not a great film, but I'm a big fan of this moment in Roman Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Hunters, where somebody shows a crucifix to a vampire and the vampire just goes in this exaggerated Yiddish accent. Oi, have you got the wrong vampire?
Okay, yeah. That'd be more difficult, I mean, logistically, wouldn't it? Because the symbol of a crucifix, you just need 2 sticks to produce it. Would the equivalent with a Jewish vampire be a Star of David?
Which would increases the number of sticks. It's more of an expenditure.
Yeah. You'd realistically need 6, which means you'd need, several hands. You'd need 2 or 3 people collaborating, really, to hold them in place.
It would look like a sort of experimental dance piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to have to sit down and draw up a chart for all the world's religions, really.
Yes. But yeah, maybe do that off air.
Yeah.
Before we move on, do you have any final thoughts about Near Dark?
Not really. I was going to point out that it might be an influence on the kind of drifting vampires from Buffy, the slightly more modern vampires from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners will have watched. Yeah. But Spike and Drusilla, probably this is a bit of ancestry for them. And I guess
a lot about Spike when they start singeing in the sun. I thought that seemed to have been quite a strong influence on some of the stuff with Spike in that show.
Yeah, in fact, I'm pretty sure that some of the vampires, I can't remember if it's Spike or not, I mean, really do just drive around in cars with blacked out windows with kind of like welding goggles on, which is more or less directly pinched here from Near Dark. In spite of that, to tell you the truth, I still felt very slightly kind of underwhelmed by it overall. I think maybe my hopes were too high. I don't know. It's funny in a way. It doesn't have much of a kind of epic quality to it, and it doesn't even sort of sensationalise. There's not really much of a kind of context where the character is amazed that the vampires exist and finds out about the history of them all over the world and that kind of thing. It's more just dealt with at the personal level, more or less among this guy's family. They go to the cops at one point and say, what are you going to do about this kidnapping?
Yeah.
And the cops are completely useless, of course. They just go after them with guns for a bit and it doesn't work.
Yes, yeah.
So it's quite a kind of personal story. It has pretty good sort of cinematography and a lot of kind of shots of the characters stumbling across open ground in the sort of American desert, and silhouetted against the sunrise.
Yeah, it's kind of an 80s thing, that, isn't it? The 80s were, even the big films were often about little neighbourhood stories.
Yeah, so I don't know, if all of that sounds like it appeals, like you say, I think it's worth a watch for, it's what, economical length? How long is it? 90 minutes?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
It's the kind of thing where, to tell you the truth, it could have been done... Yeah, it could have been done sort of more episodically. You could have put in more adventures among the vampires in the middle. Or you could have had a TV series out of it, which admittedly then would just end up being like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I guess.
yes, it would. But yeah, I really dug it as a flashback to the era of Catherine Bigelow's career that I have consistently called Fun Era Bigelow.
Yes. Okay.
So have we got... did you think of anything to watch alongside this?
Ooh, tough one. No, sorry, Graham. I don't know if I have a recommendation there. I don't know if have you got anything in mind?
Well, I was thinking about the confluence of several things, of a good, compact early work from someone who went on to become a major director, a sort of local siege setting, and really memorable villain, and also a scene where shafts of sunlight come out of bullet holes, and I think you'd probably have to watch it opposite Blood Simple.
Ooh, okay, yeah, that's a good pick. Yeah.
The scene we were talking about with the shootout at the trailer park did make me think that maybe Bigelow had seen Blood Simple and thought, that would be really rad if we did it with vampires.
Yeah. Is Blood Simple the one that ends up involving someone getting buried alive?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So it's already quite a gothic kind of a crime film.
Yeah. Although the other thing would be to say that the kind of European Gothic component isn't that strongly there in Near Dark, and you could, if anything, you could say that it in a way inhabits a bit more sort of vaguely, well, what I would sometimes call like scrap punk or diesel punk gets called that. The Mad Max movies, for example.
Oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah,
it manages to capture slightly some of the same kind of aesthetic with the kind of battered vehicles. Well, yeah, and the kind of desert landscapes, I guess.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking out one of the podcasts in our merry little family. We really do appreciate it. Podcasts aren't all we do. We're also making strides into the world of video. If you like what you've heard and want more, then head on over to YouTube and search for The Geek Show. On our channel, we have video game and low-budget tech reviews, video game chatter in Press X, animation discussions in Keyframe, movie visual essays in Shortcuts, needlessly nerdy lists with Listomania, interviews from our travels, and much, much more. The future's bright, and who knows what else it holds. So don't forget to search for The Geek Show, subscribe, and click that notification bell to stay up to date.
So, if you're enjoying listening to the show and you want to help us keep recording these podcasts, you can donate to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show. The Geek Show is the name of our parent company. We have a website at thegeekshow.co.uk where you can find The Geek Shop. We are on Facebook, just search for The Geek Show, and we're on Twitter at TGS_The Geek Show. So, yes, we mentioned the Geek Show website there. If you go there, you can find some of our written reviews that won't feature on this show. For example, we have Mark Cunliffe reviewing Orphans, the debut film by the Scottish actor and director Peter Mullen. If you follow us on social media, which you should, you will also find details about our questions of the week. And this week, we realised that we were recording on David Lynch's birthday. That's right, it's David Lynch's birthday. If you didn't come to party, then why did you click play? And we asked, what is your favourite David Lynch thing? We specified it, as a film, a TV show, an acting role, a haircut, any of the spectrum of Lynch's creative activities. And I'm not saying we put this out a bit late, but we got one reply.
Yes. Well, that scarcely matters, does it, Graham, in the context of you're being willing to talk about David Lynch on any subject at any length at all times. In fact, it's a miracle, really, we've managed to stop you until now or have any episodes lacking in this quality.
Yes, this is very true. Oh, hang on. No, we've got a second answer, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
The first answer we got was on Twitter, where our old pal Rob Simpson said, because it's the one that made Lynch click for me, Mulholland Drive.
Okay.
Now, on Facebook, Ashley Lane has a very creative interpretation of the idea of a Lynch thing.
What has he suggested?
Because it is impossible to answer this question, he says, I shall instead give some obscure trivia. In the animation series Gravity Falls, Bill Cipher's voice was inspired by how Gordon Cole speaks. This is not surprising to anyone who's seen either show. Actually, I do have something. I loved the moment in Twin Peaks: The Return when we discovered that Cole wasn't fooled for a minute by the doppelganger. Despite his comical manner, Cole is extremely good at his job. And it's true, I love Gordon Cole.
Well, that's a pretty good answer. That seems to me quite an in-depth answer. I've never seen Gravity Falls.
I haven't either, but I'm very excited to hear that voice now.
Yeah. What's your answer then?
Well, I mean, mine's been slightly preempted by Rob because I do adore Mulholland Drive, and I saw it at a preview screening as part of the London Film Festival in 2001 in an audience absolutely rammed full of David Lynch obsessives. And, it has to be said, one person who on the way out said, so he also made the nice movie about the old man on the lawnmower.
I wonder where that person is now. Hopefully listening.
hopefully safe.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it is Mulholland Drive, but I would also have to say I have been beating the drum for so long about Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and I'm so delighted that it's got a new audience, if only because, people who used to think it was completely incomprehensible and self-indulgent now have to admit that it is, at worst, the second most incomprehensible part of the Twin Peaks mythos.
Yeah, and I dived into Firewalk with Me thinking, well, somewhat sceptical, thinking, not being so intimately familiar with all of Twin Peaks, was I going to understand any of it? Was it going to make any sense? And actually, it took me, I kind of very gradually across the length of the movie thought, yeah, this is actually dead good and basically works, standalone near enough.
It was actually the first Twin Peaks thing I saw, and I've spoke to a few other people who've said the same thing. And yeah, I think if you're prepared to accept that, obviously it is a spin-off of a TV show and there will be references to the TV show, it works perfectly well.
I think I reviewed it on here, didn't I?
You did. We
a couple of years ago.
Crop up as Director's Lottery one week.
Yeah, yeah.
Good show that.
Yeah. I've got to drop in a reference to June. That was his version of June, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
The bizarre. Whether you can say he made June, did he? Was he ultimately kind of semi-fulfilling the promise of Hodorowski's version of June? It was a kind of sort of deformed descendant of that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it would get made, and it would be by someone who is great but has absolutely no business helming a multi-million-dollar film.
Yeah. Well, I rather enjoyed David Lynch's Dune, even though a lot of people think a lot of things about it are just stupid and awful. And overall, quite a few things about it do seem very silly. And nevertheless, I think it's kind of enjoyable enough if you have to indulge it. I was going to bring it up partly because we've got another adaptation of Dune coming this year, haven't we?
We do, yeah, by Denis Villeneuve.
Yeah, who made... it's stupid to have now temporarily forgotten the name of the sci-fi movie that he made with the alien ambassadors speaking. Arrival, of course, yeah.
Arrival, yeah.
Which was a terrific bit of a kind of more sort of hard sci-fi, really, dealing with the realities of an alien turning up for the first time. And Dune pretty much goes and departs off at, hyper speed away from the Earth for that. But I don't know when that's due, presumably later in the year or late in the year.
I think it's like late summer, early autumn, like around September time, something like that. But it's got a hell of a cast too.
Yeah. It's so it's got to be it's surely going to be worth a watch one way or the other. I mean, someone trying to make Dune a film of is usually good for a laugh one way or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, the track record of Dune adaptations has been, good luck is all we're saying.
Yeah, best of luck still. Did you have any more Lynch answers, or is that it?
I mean, you know me, I could continue answering what is your favourite David Lynch thing for most of the day, but if you want a deep cut, he made a 1-minute short as part of an anthology project to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Lumiere brothers screening Train Arriving at a Station. Lynch's short is called Premonitions Following an Evil Deed. It was made in one take with the first movie camera, and it is mind-blowing.
What do you mean with the first movie camera?
The camera that filmed the first movie.
The first movie ever?
Evs, yes.
Right. So literally the first movie camera?
Yeah.
Okay, that was not that ambiguous a statement, really, was it? All right, fair enough, yeah. Literally the first movie camera.
Yeah.
Where can I get this? Is it as an extra on anything?
It probably is. It's pretty easy to find online. But yeah, it's just a minute long and it's great.
Premonitions of an Evil Deed.
Premonitions Following an Evil Deed.
Premonitions Following?
Yeah, the evil deed has been done, and now we're going to have a bit of premonitions to ease us into the night.
Right. So it's not a premonition of the evil deed that comes afterwards. One of those retroactive premonitions.
I mean, we've all seen Twin Peaks. It could be.
Yeah, well, true, yeah. I'll stop trying to nitpick that now. Fair enough, yeah. It sounds pretty interesting.
Mm. So, onto Off the Shelf, and we've got a big load of stuff from Indicator Powerhouse, who are always an interesting label, always dig up something reliably off the radar. Mark's review of Orphans, I think, is one of their titles. I ended up with Winter Kills, which is a very, very odd project. And I mean, it was also very unsuccessful when it was released. I have to say that I was not as persuaded by its cult status as I was with Near Dark. But if you are looking for someone to make the case very passionately for it, the disc is superb and contains lots of excellent extras, which we'll get onto in due course. But for now, Winter Kills is a film directed by William Richard, who all of his films kind of seem to have this pattern of coming out, not doing very well, and then sort of picking up a small but dedicated cult following. He made a film called A Night in the Life of Jimmy Reardon, starring River Phoenix in one of his first big lead roles. Again, that bombed. Now it has a lot of people who really love that film very much, and so does Winter Kills. It's based on a novel by Richard Condon, who, of course, wrote The Manchurian Candidate. And I don't know exactly when the novel was published. I can tell you when it was published after, for reasons that should become apparent. But it does seem to be a response to the curious afterlife of The Manchurian Candidate, that it was one of those films, like that other Sinatra vehicle, Suddenly, that sort of became tasteless overnight. Sinatra became very antsy about Suddenly in The Manchurian Candidate in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, and he pulled them from distribution for quite a long time. And Winter Kills feels like Richard and Condon are trying to take on that kind of mythological status that the earlier film had. It's about a guy called Nick Keegan, who's the brother of a fictional American president called Timothy Keegan. And Keegan was assassinated in Philadelphia in what sound like incredibly Kennedy-esque circumstances, like the fact that their surnames sound the same is no coincidence. And a large part of what Winter Kills is doing is it's doing a sort of Edgar Allan Poe mystery of Marie Roget kind of thing to the Kennedy assassination, where it takes what we know about the killing, it takes the characters involved in it, and very, very loosely fictionalizes them with sort of very easily cracked false names to try and solve the mystery. I think that's what Condon was doing, at least. How much Richard was invested in it? Well, there were interviews and a good commentary with him on the disc where he says he could only really view the novel, despite the fact that he's full of praise for Condon, he could only really view the novel as a kind of burlesque of the Kennedy case. That he didn't really take it all that seriously. It has to be said that a lot of the details in it, particularly involving the mafia and their loss of Cuban casinos, are so familiar from actual serious Kennedyiana that I started to get flashbacks to the Kennedy bits in Martin Scorsese's The Irishman. But I would have to say that The Irishman is a much better film than Winter Kills. It starts with Nick Keegan, whose position is kind of not clear. I think he's meant to be a kind of Ted Kennedy figure, although the parallel doesn't quite work. He reminded me almost of a premonition of John F. Kennedy Jr. in that he's this sort of socialite playboy who's seen as quite a vapid, pretty boy rather than a serious political contender. But he starts by going to his father's oil tanker and meeting a heavily bandaged man played by Joe Spinell, who horror fans will remember as the killer from the original film Maniac, who croaks out this confession of having been the man who killed President Keegan. And he's attended on by this like member of the Keegan entourage, a guy in a poncho played by Richard Boone, who says afterwards that after the death of President Keegan, 16 people who seem to have no connection to the case whatsoever died in mysterious circumstances. And you think, right, if that's the only qualification to be on the list, if they have to have had nothing to do with President Keegan and also die in unexplained circumstances, give me like 10 minutes on Wikipedia and I will find you more than 16.
Yeah. What are the odds that other people who didn't have any connection would die worldwide? Yeah.
They've covered up the connections so well that it appears they do not exist at all.
Isn't it suspicious that these people are completely innocent of the assassination?
So at moments like this, you can kind of understand Richard's take on the material as a kind of farce. And it has to be said, one of the film's main assets, it has an all-star cast, most of whom are completely wasted, but it does have an amazing, rampantly over-the-top performance by John Huston as the sort of Joe Kennedy figure. This obscene, corrupt, philandering, elderly southern bigot who rules the entire Keegan dynasty with an iron fist. And, I mean, he is quite fantastic. And there is a remarkable aside, which is, I think, the one thing that has true predictive power in this film, where he says that he's going to a Swiss clinic to have a complete blood transfusion using pure blood from children. I thought, oh my God, did this film predict Peter Thiel?
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, I mean, I have this, like you say, calling it a kind of farce. I have this in my head as a kind of dark comedy, satirical sort of thing. I've not actually seen it. But how much is the balance between that and actual kind of thriller drama?
Well, it's uncomfortable, really. I mean, I didn't feel engaged with it as a thriller plot. It has this strange thing where an awful lot of money appears to have been spent on exactly the wrong scenes. You know, that the opening scene on board the oil tanker has this remarkable effect where the whole set is put inside a hydraulic kind of contraption so that the characters can be sort of buffeted around realistically. But when it gets on to trying to crack down into the actual conspiracy, it mostly just happens with people in rooms explaining the plot to each other. So it's quite unsatisfying there. And the other thing is, crucially, barring those few moments I've discussed there, I just didn't find it funny. The humour mostly seems to revolve around the fact that the Keegans are all terrible lechers. And it is quite astonishing to think the film made a whole 10 years after Midnight Cowboy can still expect to get big laughs just from not even sex jokes. Sex jokes I'm fine with, but like mentioning that sex is a thing that has happened. Like sex acknowledgements, I guess, rather than jokes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was quite poor. And as I say, it has this extraordinary cast which it doesn't use properly. Toshiro Mifune turns up as John Huston's enforcer, and he gets about sort of 3 lines. Richard says in the extras that they got Mifune thinking, oh, great, this guy's the greatest actor in the world, but then discovered that he found it very hard to speak English, which I would say would be the sort of thing you should check out before you hire someone for an English language movie.
Yeah.
So it's kind of wasteful, and like I say, it does have this weird thing where the most banal scenes appear to have bust the budget, but the rest of it is cobbled together, and in the extras you find out why. Because this fantastic extras package, which I have only just scratched the surface of, comes with a 40-minute documentary made for the Anchor Bay release in 2003 called Who Killed Winter Kills. And Richard and the rest of the cast have interviewed Jeff Bridges, who played Nick Keegan in one of his very early lead roles. He's interviewed quite a lot of the rest of the surviving cast have. But Richard in particular says he read the book, he wanted to film it, but because of its Kennedy parallels, he found it very hard to get backing. One of the few people who was really enthusiastic was John Huston. And John Huston was enthusiastic because he met Joe Kennedy and hated him.
Right.
So for a lot of other people, particularly people who they wanted to use locations from, a lot of other people said, no, we will not have you insulting the Kennedy dynasty on our property. But they found backing in the form of two people called Robert Sterling and Leonard Goldberg, who were former dope dealers who had gone into the film industry after buying the rights to a softcore porn film that no legitimate distributor wanted to touch. And that film was the original Emmanuel, which of course became a massive hit and made them briefly legitimate movie moguls. It gave them the opportunity to bank I would say, I don't know exactly how much this cost, but it's a ridiculous amount of money to pay for something that it looks far too expensive for such a cliquey kind of in-jokey thing. And everything seemed to be going quite well until in the middle of production, Leonard Goldberg, the producer, became the 17th person connected with President Keegan to die in unexplained circumstances. He was probably, it is now thought, killed by the mafia over outstanding debts. The film was held up in limbo until they finally managed to extract it from the Bond company and film some additional scenes to stitch it together about a whole year later.
What you're saying is basically that the story of the film being made meshes perfectly into the kind of sprawling web of Kennedy conspiracy theories. I mean, it's, you can pretty much just merge its plot via its production into real life, and there's no clear way to separate that out. What with the mafia connection and so on.
Yeah, I am genuinely surprised that I haven't seen any theories try and work the death of Lenny Goldberg into the Kennedy assassination. It seems to be made for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of Winter Kills all over, really. It is a film whose backstage shenanigans are much more interesting than what's on scene. Richard Roper, the late US film critic, used to have a test for these films with all-star casts where he said, is it more or less interesting than watching a documentary about the cast having dinner together? And I think, Winter Kills has John Huston, it has Jeff Bridges, it has Mifune, there's a cameo by Elizabeth Taylor, there's another cameo by Sterling Hayden. Of course you'd watch a documentary about these guys having dinner together, but the nearest thing you're going to get to that is listening to all of these absolutely insane behind-the-scenes stories on this indicator disc. So although I cannot recommend the film, it feels half-finished in a way that made a lot of sense when I heard how it had been made. It feels like it's just hopping from set piece to set piece without much sense to it. But what a story and what a set of extras. And that's Winter Kills, which is out this coming Monday, I believe, the 27th on Indicator Powerhouse Pictures.
That sounds like a bit of a letdown, because I admit, thinking by the sound of it, it could have a bit of the sort of 70s audio tape-powered kind of paranoid conspiracy theory vibe to it. And I kind of enjoy that. I mean, you said it was characters just sitting in rooms explaining the plot to each other half the time, which I kind of think in the genre of like 70s thrillers with a bit of a political angle, I find that to be quite a good aesthetic, really. And just have giant tape recorders with wheels turning, I found pretty much to be entertainment in itself. But obviously,
get me wrong, I like that sort of thing in a film like The Conversation, which is set up as a small-scale story about people sitting in rooms making no threats to each other. But when you've already had a scene where, for instance, Jeff Bridges' car is forced off the road by a battalion of tanks headed by Sterling Hayden with a big Amish beard, it does feel a bit tonally clashing.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so what's yours?
Well, what I've got this week is a movie that seems, pretty wildly different from that, really, which is a 2018 science fiction film, Aniara, which is a Swedish movie, or sort of Swedish-Danish collaboration from not last year, but the year before, which was premiered at the Toronto Film Festival.
Yeah.
And has had a sort of limited theatrical release this year gone. I don't know how widely it showed up in UK cinemas. Not all that much, I don't think. But is a very much a kind of high concept. Well, I don't know what counts as high concept. Pretty much kind of full-on sci-fi movie set entirely in outer space on a luxurious spaceship in the future. And effectively follows the plot of characters and staff aboard a spaceship that's more or less a very, very large cruise liner.
Yeah.
The story being that the ship is supposed to be flying between Earth and Mars. Effectively, the Earth having been doomed more or less by environmental catastrophe, implicitly kind of something vaguely similar to global warming, or caused by climate collapse of some kind. The ship is en route to Mars, and due to the most absurdly unlikely and minor accident, more or less, the ship is struck in deep space by a single drifting bit of debris, a sort of screw or a nail or a little shard of metal. And this has the effect of deflecting the ship from its course and destroying its fuel reserves to the point where it can never change course again. And so the whole of this movie more or less follows the characters who are staff members on this cruise liner and passengers on the cruise liner, realizing that actually there's no prospect of ever reaching their destination, and they're going to just head off into outer space forever. Yeah. And so suddenly they're kind of stranded aboard the stricken ship with the rather unusual threat, rather than there being any kind of alien creature on board threatening them, of just the fact that time is eventually going to catch up with them, and nobody quite kind of coming to terms with the extent of that problem and the fact they're going to live out their lives on this ship and it's never going to reach anything. It's just going to keep going into the void. Yeah. And that's like a pretty kind of high sci-fi premise, I guess, in a way. There aren't any space aliens in Aniara. It does have a few bits of... It follows the idea the ship has something a little bit like the holodeck, or a slightly more plausible version of the holodeck from Star Trek, which is what the main character of the movie is just referred to as Mimarobe, being the supervisor of Mima, which is the system that gives you the kind of dreamlike state, the kind of fantasy virtual reality thing of the ship. And she pretty much has to look after all the passengers who want to go into this kind of dreamlike, semi-conscious kind of fugue state and experience just like dreams of lovely landscapes like waterfalls and things like that and clouds billowing in the breeze, rather than face the reality that they're on board a spaceship just drifting endlessly through the void with no prospect of ever getting back to civilization. And it makes a pretty good effort at this kind of premise, given it obviously had... You would have to say it has a big but not a huge budget, and it's the kind of relying to some extent on the same thing you'd see with these kind of sci-fi movies, of realizing, well, it's possible to do the interior of a spaceship comparatively cheaply. The inside of a spaceship is cheaper than doing the surface of an alien planet, and is cheaper than doing probably a lot of very deep space kind of stuff on the outside of a spaceship, doing space battles and that sort of stuff. There was So people who are fans of this, I mean, I guess in a way that the obvious one that it resembles most closely is the movie from a few years ago, Passengers, which had Chris Pratt and...
Yeah, that Chris. And Jennifer Lawrence
in it, which was a pretty serious kind of flop, at least critically at the time. Was regarded quite widely as being complete rubbish.
Yes.
And in that case, Passengers was more or less, the same thing, roughly speaking, which was a kind of, movie about castaways, ironically stranded aboard the ship, having not reached its destination. In that case, they were woken up from their cryogenic freezing pods early. And in Aniara, pretty much everyone is already awake at the start. They're expecting it to be a 3-month cruise on a very kind of tacky cruise liner, which is more or less like the inside of a shopping mall. And instead it's just, well, no, it's going to go on forever. It's going to go on to infinity. But The thing about that is that the kind of conceit that it's a kind of sort of slightly commercialized environment, like a sort of naff shopping mall or kind of like holiday spa, probably is kind of papering over the fact that they've had to film in a lot of environments, in place of actual sets that are rather like that. There are bits of it filmed in what looks like a shopping mall or a kind of community centre of some kind on board cruise liners, or in some cases it's like they gather the passengers together and it's sort of, well, all of the passengers gathered in the sort of atrium is rather like the modern, like the kind of a sort of modern lecture theatre or something of the type. So there's a lot of environments that are quite modern looking and that have been quite neatly kind of stitched into the few bits of kind of CGI they've got for the outside of the spaceship to kind of disguise the fact that maybe they've got more interior sets to use as part of locations rather than being able to build a whole kind of sci-fi world for themselves. But nevertheless, it works pretty well trying for these kind of high sci-fi ideas about the sort of infinite universe that's ahead of them and coming to terms with the idea that they might live out, generations and build a whole society on board this kind of doomed ship that's left Earth behind it completely. There's another movie which is probably less well known, which was, I don't know how long ago it was now, 10 years ago or more, which was a movie called Pandorum. I don't know if you ever came across this, Graham. I would expect not.
Rings the faintest of bells.
It had, what's the guy called? Dennis Quaid in it, I think.
Right.
It was the actor, but it was a comparatively little-known sci-fi movie from a few years ago, which followed more or less the crew of a kind of stricken ship that was supposed to be heading for a new planet in order to colonize it, but either it had just crashed somewhere or was just drifting through space forever and had missed the target. But that was played much more as a kind of creepy sort of horror thing where the things on board the ship had degenerated into kind of weird creatures and stuff like that. But again, exploiting the trick really that if you have a movie set entirely on the inside of a spaceship that's just in the endless void, you don't necessarily need a huge sci-fi budget. You're not creating much more of a world there than just kind of blackness, papered over the windows.
Yeah.
And more or less, Aniara follows this main character, the Mimarobe, who never gets an actual name, as she deals with the increasing kind of alienation and despair of the passengers of this ship and the crew, and tries to live through. And the movie hops ahead quite increasingly dramatic periods of time. This is kind of the main sort of trick it's got to shock you, is saying, well, the characters at the start, all the passengers of the ship are gathered together for a thing saying, we know that it said on the website that this cruise was going to take 3 months and then you'd be on Mars. But actually, it's going to take us 2 years to turn the ship around. And of course, everyone gasps in horror. And it's like, well, you're just going to have to live on the ship for 2 years. Only, of course, it's not 2 years. They then realise, it's going to take another 5 years, sorry. And at various points, the screen goes black and it says, year 5 of the voyage, year 7 of the voyage, year 12 of the voyage, and so on, with kind of increasingly long jumps. And you would have thought maybe they could have done it literally passing by generations. It doesn't quite get that far, really. It kind of wraps it up with all of that still ahead. I mean, it has, in a way, quite a bleak addressing of this premise. They don't get an easy solution to this premise. They kind of come close a few times to some pretty weird stuff. But I don't know if I have a lot to say about it, really, except that if you like the sound of that, it works pretty well. I mean, the thing about it is it starts with a kind of portrayal of like commercial spaceflight that very much is in the shadow still of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's like, well, trying to make a sci-fi movie that's not in the shadow of 2001: A Space Odyssey is pretty challenging, I suppose. Yeah. But it kind of like has the portrayals of the commercial space age where you can take a luxury space liner flight between Earth and Mars, and it effectively ends up kind of repeating much of the same ground you see in. Let me think. Is it chapter 2 of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the second quarter of the film?
Oh, yeah.
So the trouble Aniara has is that because it's kind of trying to punch above its weight a bit in terms of the budget, using these sets to portray this kind of very large spaceship, it ends up with a very slightly kind of TV movie-ish feel to it. That you get good CGI for the exterior of the ship, but you won't see much kind of overlap, possibly reflecting the fact they didn't know how good the CGI was going to be, or what the sets available to them were going to be. But it's Yeah, so, there's not really any, there's zero gravity, which they can do with the occasional CGI shot of a floating book or something hovering inside the cabin, but most of the time, when they realise the gravity's going to have to run out, they have to strap all the characters down in their beds, because there's not a lot of wire work or CGI available to have characters actually floating around the ship very much.
That's inventive, I guess.
Yeah. So the ultimate kind of theme of it, I think, is a kind of environmental sort of parable, really, to do with climate change and global warming, which I think sits there and it sort of bubbles away in the subtext of the movie. More or less, Aniara has very good sci-fi world building in this way. You never see the surface of the Earth or anything about the Earth. Yeah. You never see Mars. But you catch a glimpse occasionally in the background of passengers on this cruise liner who have been kind of disfigured or horribly burned in some way. And the implication is more or less that they're survivors from the Earth who obviously have lived with some sort of, either massive scale global warming or solar flares or something of the type that's necessitated Earth being abandoned due to some terrible conditions or other. The biosphere becoming roasting hot or whatever, and Earth being turned into a desert. And implicitly in the movie, it's kind of normalised that characters have been affected in this way. And I think pretty much you can read it as a kind of allegory saying, well, the Aniara, the ship itself, becomes the new kind of life support system for humanity in this film, because they're just left drifting off through space by themselves and ultimately don't cope with it terribly well. And whether that leaves a bleak message for humanity's future, where, there's kind of, you look through this meme holographic system, you can gain kind of glimpses of nature being perfect and being a very reassuring environment.
Yeah.
And then that kind of departs more and more from the actual real life that people are living in, and increasingly bleak kind of civilization breaks down aboard the spaceship. And I don't know, should I avoid spoiling what eventually happens to them?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, probably. I think so. Yeah, there are things to discover, and maybe you'll realise, I hope, as you work your way through this movie, how it's such a kind of open-ended premise for becoming sort of reassuring or about, humanity's place in the cosmos, or becoming absolutely horrifying, and you'll have to watch it yourself to see which way it ends up going.
I hate to puncture the air of gloomy philosophical contemplation, but I am absolutely struck by the ship being called the Mima.
Well, the ship is not called the Mima. The environment which you go into to have a kind of amazing exposure to these kind of holographic environments, that's what's called the Mima. The ship is called the Aniara. Yeah, but Graham is referring to his. Sorry,
but it is.
No, go on, Graham. You explain it.
Yeah, but it is presumably named after Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, right?
So I would assume, yes. There's a certain amount of outreach from the. Bit of a departure from the Swedish film industry there, a bit of a pot shot on their behalf. But I presume, it's supposed to be a commentary on the absolutely amazing environment of exhibits and the cross-section of the human experience that you get in the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art.
Defo, yeah.
Yeah. So that's Aniara, out now on Blu-ray.
So, coming out on Friday, I'm not saying it's a thin week for new releases, but one of the big things in 300 plus locations is Paw Patrol Ready Race Rescue.
Paw Patrol?
Yes.
Dog police?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
We've got another one of a growing subgenre of films in which last decade's indie horror hopefuls are co-opted by the machine to remake something that didn't need remaking. This time it's Nicholas Pesk doing a new version of The Grudge.
For Pete's sake, but how can you need to remake The Grudge? I mean, you just... Yeah, all right. We'll just watch it again, won't we, I suppose, The Grudge. Yeah. No, go on. We've got a what?
We've got a 4K restoration of Alejandro Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain, his most lavish and mad film, with Cortez's conquest of the Americas famously recreated by a cast of costumed lizards and frogs.
That sounds absolutely amazing. I've never seen that.
I saw it once several years ago, and there were still parts of it that are burned into my memory. It's
still like something. You occasionally still have flashbacks to it.
Yes. And finally, there's the film that we will have as Film of the Week next week, Armando Iannucci's sidestep into period drama, The Personal History of David Copperfield, with an amazing cast. Deep breath, everyone. Dev Patel, Tilda Swinton, Hugh Laurie, Peter Capaldi, Ben Whishaw, Paul Whitehouse, Anirin Bernard, Daisy May Cooper, Benedict Wong, and Gwendolyn Christie.
Wow, okay. So basically, an absolute mass of first-rate talent from British TV, I guess. I mean, kind of from film, but...
Yeah,
that sounds pretty great.
So, until next week with The Personal History of David Copperfield, that's been your lot from Cinema Eclectica. I've been Graham.
And I've been Tim.
See you next week.